Kia ora.
G'day.
Kia ora and welcome. My name's Gareth.
And I'm Roger.
And together we're...
Gareth and Roger.
Welcome to this Rainbow Walk Tour, and today it is the Violet Walk Tour starting from Parliament here in Wellington, New Zealand, and we'll be covering kind of Parliament, the Terrace, Lambton Quay, and then on to the Waterfront. So we're going to be talking about specific sites along this 1 hour tour, but we'll also be giving you some broader context to rainbow history in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Great. So here we are at Parliament, and we've got an image that will be interesting to see of some flags flying.
Oh, we should just...
first we're going to do this. Great.
Yes, we've just got some new technology, and so we are just just adding some kind of animations as well. So before we animate, we should say thank you to Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young.
Yeah, for their contribution. A lot of their research has been used in this walk tour and others.
Right. Okay, so we're just going to fly in now to Parliament, and we're going to be starting on the forecourt of Parliament, and just flying in there. Another beautiful sunny day here in Wellington, and that's a lovely shot. And on the forecourt of Parliament last year, we would have seen this.
Right, so this is a very special photo for a number of reasons. One, because it is flying 4 flags, which are of particular rainbow importance. There's, from left to right, there's the bisexual flag, then the intersex flag, and then the rainbow flag and the transgender flag. But interestingly, they are all flying at half-mast, and that is because this image was taken in March 2019, just days after the Christchurch Mosque massacre. And so all the flags were flying at half-mast then, and they were all out, for instance, on this occasion for the ILGA World Conference in Wellington, which was also happening at this time. Now, this was only the second time that these flags had been flown at Parliament, and we'll talk a little bit more about flags flying at Parliament a bit later on in the tour. But first of all, let's start this tour not on the steps of Parliament, but half a world away and 50 years ago in the UK with the Wolfenden Report, which, the Parliamentary Sexual Offences Act of July 1967, which decriminalised homosexual acts between men aged over 21 in England and Wales. And that was a direct result of the Wolfenden Report from the 1950s, which had recommended that homosexual behaviour should no longer be considered a criminal offence. Change was happening in New Zealand too, and so from the first meeting of the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society occurred in Wellington also in 1967.
We just have a little teleprompter,
technical thing here.
a little teleprompter in front of us that wasn't working.
Really prompting very well. So it wasn't until 1974 that the first major parliamentary attempt at law reform happened in New Zealand, and that was with the National MP Ven Young and the Crimes Amendment Bill, which proposed an age of consent of 21. Now keep in mind that for heterosexual sex, the age of consent is 16. The Labour Prime Minister of the time, Norman Kirk, opposed the bill. He said that he wouldn't support any legislation that treated homosexuality as a normal behaviour. At the same time, gay and lesbian liberation groups were forming around New Zealand, and they were becoming ever more vocal. In July 1975, the Labour MP Gerald Wall moved an amendment that proposed imprisonment for anyone who communicated with a person under the age of 20 about homosexuality. Now, that means that support groups that we know today, like Rainbow Youth or Inside Out, along with any high school peer support groups, would have been illegal. Now, there was a lot of opposition to Gerald Wall's proposed amendment, and as you can see from this image here, which was taken at the steps of Parliament, Gerald Wall is there lecturing the crowd. He's there on the left, and the crowd are not very keen on what he has to say. Ven Young's bill was ultimately defeated by 5 votes, that's 34 to 29, but with 23 abstentions in Parliament, and that just shows how much politicians at the time really didn't want to engage with the issue.
But whether they wanted to engage with the issue or not, the issue and the activists weren't going away. So in the mid-70s, we had Robin Duff stand as an openly gay candidate for Parliament. He didn't get in, but he stood as an openly gay man. Roger, when do you think the first openly gay politician occurred in New Zealand?
When? Well, I'm going to say the 1970s with Marilyn Waring.
Which is true, although Marilyn Waring was actually outed by the New Zealand Truth newspaper. So she was out to her close family and circles, but in terms of the mass of New Zealand, she was outed by the New Zealand Truth. It wasn't actually until 1993 when Chris Carter came into Parliament, the first MMP election, 1993, and he was an openly gay member of Parliament. What about the first openly lesbian member of Parliament?
Okay, we're even looking at the script. I'm going to say Marion Street.
Oh, Marion Street, yes, Marion Street. But Marion Street, that was 2005, and so that's not that long ago. And what about the first openly transgender member of Parliament in the world?
Georgina Beyer.
Georgina Beyer, correct. And this is a photo of Georgina as Mayor of Carterton District. So the Carterton District is just north of Wellington, and Georgina became mayor in the 1990s and then moved into national politics and became a member of Parliament in the late 1990s and became the first openly transgender person in the world to be, one, a mayor, but also a member of Parliament. In 2011, Georgina remarked that one of her proudest moments was welcoming Carmen Rupe, who's an icon here in Wellington, in New Zealand and in Australia, back to Parliament to meet the Leader of the Opposition and to meet the Prime Minister. The only other time Carmen Rupe had been at Parliament was in the 1970s, when she said in a television interview that she knew of both bisexual and a gay member of Parliament. And Parliament was so affronted by this because, it was still illegal, but they thought it would bring Parliament into disrepute. And so they called Carmen before the Privileges Committee in Parliament and made her apologise because it was obviously the worst thing
ever.
Worst thing ever.
Always makes me laugh that, because I think as though Parliament needs any help being brought into disrepute these days anyway. But anyway, while we're talking about Parliament, on the 8th of March 1985, Fran Wilde introduced the Homosexual Law Reform Bill, and here's a great image of her in the Parliament lobby talking to supporters.
And this is a David Hinley image, thanks to David.
Yes, very great thanks to him. Now, Fran's bill set out to decriminalise homosexual acts between adult consenting males and make it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their sexual orientation. So this took 16 months of heated debate, both in Parliament and out in the public. But eventually, Part 1 of the bill, that which dealt with decriminalising homosexual acts between consenting adults, passed on the 9th of July 1986. However, Part 2 of the bill, that which dealt with discrimination, was lost, and so you could still discriminate against homosexuals in a number of areas. Now, Gareth, can you tell me what areas those might have been?
I can tell you, and I can also say before I mention them, that if you are looking on YouTube, we now have the technology where we can actually see comments coming up on our screen, which is fantastic. Or you can send us an email to walks@taonga.nz, and we can see that as well. So please feel free if you want to want to add your stories as well. But the three ways in which you could discriminate: one was accommodation, so somebody could say, I'm not going to rent to you because you're gay. Another way was in services, so you can go into a store and they could refuse to serve you because they thought you were gay. And the third way was in employment, so they could say, no, I'm not going to employ any homosexuals.
So despite homosexual law reform in 1987, you could still quite legally and quite happily discriminate in those areas until the Human Rights Amendment Act of, just the Human Rights Act, I should say, of 1993. And that act also outlawed discrimination on the grounds of disability and HIV/AIDS. Now, the amendments to the Human Rights Act were championed by the Associate Minister of Health, Catherine O'Regan, who sadly passed away in May 2018. In 2012, she apologised for not specifically including transgender people in the anti-discrimination measures.
Well, speaking of HIV and AIDS, and that was happening in the kind of, there was a lot of mainstream attention drawn to AIDS in the mid-1980s when AIDS was used by both the pro and anti-homosexual law reformers as a rallying cry. So the anti-reformers, including this chap here, this is Norman Jones, who was the MP for Invercargill. He would say things like, if somebody had AIDS, it would be better for them to die sooner rather than later to help prevent homosexual law reform. And so his whole thing was that in legalising homosexual activity, you'd be legalising the spread of AIDS. That was one of his sayings. The pro-reformers were saying that actually we need to get people in to see their doctors, into health clinics, and people aren't going to go if it's an illegal activity. And so both those things were happening around homosexual law reform in 84, 85, 86. And at our next stop, we're going to be talking about one of New Zealand's earliest AIDS activists. And through modern technology, I'm going to hit this button here without looking. It was the wrong button. And we're going to go from Parliament across the road, and we're heading across the road to Turnbull House.
Look at that.
Which is just this lovely brick building built around about 1915, just opposite the Beehive here in Wellington. And it was at Turnbull House that one of the first AIDS workshops was held in New Zealand. So to give you just a wee bit of context, in 1981, in June 1981, the CDC in America produced some information that was highlighting a group of young gay men who had developed PCP pneumonia, which we now know is quite interlinked with HIV and AIDS. That was 1981. The first AIDS death in New Zealand was in 1984, so we were a good couple of years after what was happening in the US. Well, one of those early people in the 1980s was, let me just see if I can find, certainly not Norman Jones, was this man. This is Bruce Burnett. And in 1983, he came back from San Francisco. So he was an Aucklander, had lived overseas, came back from San Francisco in 1983 because he was feeling unwell. And within months, he had set up a one-man roadshow around New Zealand, trying to educate communities at risk on AIDS and what was about to come. In Palmerston North, he actually himself came out as having AIDS, and he said this to the group of people, but he also said it to the media. And this was really courageous because at the time there was a huge amount of stigma around AIDS in New Zealand. Some people were saying that, you can catch AIDS from using the same swimming pool or using the same cutlery or using cups that other people have used. Of course, all this is completely wrong and it's not true. But this is what Bruce had to deal with, and not only was he dealing in his personal life, but he was also going out there on mainstream media and talking about HIV/AIDS awareness. So at the same time as doing this one-man roadshow, Bruce helped establish, or was instrumental in establishing, the AIDS support network, along with a number of other people around the country. And this support network aimed to give both practical and emotional support to people with HIV and AIDS. Now, Bruce continued with his work right up until his death. He died on the 1st of June 1985, and within 18 months the AIDS support network had morphed into what we now know as the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. But a lot of that energy, a lot of that initial energy came from people like Bruce Burnett here.
And Turnbull House also has a connection with the author, journalist and tarot card reader Tom McLean. Now, Tom is a Scottish journalist who lives in New Zealand from 1973 until his death in 1989. He wrote a book about his experiences living with HIV and AIDS called If I Should Die, and he was carried into Turnbull House on a stretcher to launch the book on the 21st of March 1989, just 3 days before he died. Now, we can see here an image of Tom's quilt panel on the AIDS Memorial quilt, and there's a great little quote along the top there. What the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the butterfly calls the miracle of life. And that relates to the book that Tom wrote, and here's another excerpt from it. Remember my story about the garden. It's spring. You hold a tiny kitten in your hand and tell me how each form of life, no matter how small, is part of life itself. When we understand space and time, we'll know that in infinity, all we have is here and now, and sometimes in the here and now, you'll turn a corner to find a little garden. We'll sit down together under a spring sun and watch the kitten and the caterpillar, and I'll tell you again about the butterflies.
It's a really beautiful book. If you get the chance to read it, it's called If I Should Die. It's quite hard to find nowadays, but it's well worth reading. Yeah. Well, just getting back to Turnbull House, which again is on our left, which is quite funny because when we're looking at on our right, but it's on the left of the screen, I think, isn't it? Well, when we look that way, we're looking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
anyway,
it doesn't really
enjoy
matter.
it. Enjoy this wonderful image.
All I'm trying to say is that Roger and I look in a different direction than it actually is, so we should be. Okay.
Yeah.
Moving on. Okay. So Turnbull House was the home of Alexander Turnbull, and Alexander was born in Wellington in 1868, and then moved with his family to London. But he returned in his early 20s. Now he was an avid collector of a whole variety of things like manuscripts, books, photographs, maps. Like there was 55,000 plus items in his collection. In 1915, he built this house here for himself and his library, and unfortunately in 1918 he had an operation on his sinuses, which actually led to his death, led to his passing. But before he died, he bequeathed his entire collection to the nation, and this is what forms New Zealand's first library collection. It's the Alexander Turnbull Library, which used to be housed in this beautiful building, but is now housed within the National Library up on Molesworth Street. Now, Alexander, in early gay circles, was believed to be a screaming queen. And I should have actually shown you, this is a photo of Alexander here, not that he's looking like a screaming queen here, but apparently in early gay circles he was he was known as a screaming queen. But subsequent investigation hasn't found any evidence to support that. But I'm not quite sure what kind of evidence you'd need.
No. We'll claim him anyway. We'll claim him. If we pivot on the spot that we are here and turn around, we can see the Cenotaph in Wellington. Now, for many years, 2 gay teachers would lay a wreath here at the Cenotaph on Anzac Day in memory of fallen gay and lesbian service people. Now, the wreath included a pink triangle, and because it did, the RSA deemed it to be too political, and so they stopped putting that particular wreath there. But anyway, it was a lovely thought. While we look at the Cenotaph, if we go a wee bit closer to it, we can see some writing which was written by Rupert Brooke, the famous English First World War poet. And the inscription reads, "These laid the world away, poured out the red, sweet wine of youth." And of course, if you remember Tom McLean's book, which was called If I Should Die, that's a line from one of Rupert Brooke's war poems, a sonnet called The Soldier. But the Irish poet W.B. Yeats described Brooke as the handsomest young man in England, and I'll let you be the judge of that. In his mid-20s, he visited Wellington. That was in January 1914, just before the war. He was on his way to Tahiti. Later that year, he was commissioned into the Royal Naval Reserve and took part in the Antwerp expedition in October 1914. He sailed again early in 1915, but developed sepsis from an infected mosquito bite and sadly died on the hospital ship on his way to Gallipoli in April 1915.
Well, we're just heading a wee bit up the hill now, so we're going to start from, if I just start this button here, we're going from the Cenotaph, and you can see the Cenotaph and the back end of Alexander Turnbull's house, and we're going to swing round and we're going to go to the right, and to the right is actually where Broadcasting House used to be. And here's a photo of Broadcasting House from the 1970s. I think this photo was done. And the reason Broadcasting House is significant to rainbow communities is that not only was it the home of public broadcasting and commercial radio in the 60s and 70s, but in the late 70s, BCNZ, the public broadcaster, started playing with the idea of offering a radio frequency for communities to make programs about their own communities. So it wouldn't involve an external editor. It would be by a community, for a community, about a community, the by, for and about model. And so the first broadcast of access radio in New Zealand was on the 5th of April 1981, and that very first broadcast had a program called Leave Your Dishes in the Sink, and it was a feminist program, and although it wasn't explicitly lesbian run, it was run by some lesbians in the collective. So we could say that was the first by, for and about lesbian broadcast in New Zealand. And then in June 1981, we had the first ever gay broadcast in New Zealand for Pride Week. So Pride Week, June 1981. And that audio is still available online. If you go to pridenz.com and search for that audio, Gay Pride 1981, you'll be able to hear some of the just the ideas and language that they were using at that time. It's a fascinating time capsule, and that was that audio was supplied by the Lesbian and Gay Archives of New Zealand, who archive our cultural heritage. 1984, we had the first lesbian community radio program broadcast, and it was explicitly lesbian community, and it was run by a collective, and it started in 1984 and has gone ever since, every week, run by a collective. Now, a few years ago, it was it had a name change, and the collective came together and turned the name into an acronym, and the acronym was Quilt. sorry, the acronym was Quilted Bananas, and that stands for Queer, Intersectional, Intersex, Lesbian, Takatapui, Trans, NB, non-binary, diverse, bisexual, asexual, and nanas, as some of them saw themselves as nanas. And the new title they described as celebrating all the slippery overlaps these communities can have, and how finding your identity within them can be messy, but as well as fun. And I think it's just a great example of how times have moved on from the 80s, where we may have only had a few words to describe our communities, to now where there's a whole range of words and a whole range of identities, and how those interrelate and overlap is really, really fascinating. There's just another image here. This is Gay BC, or the Gay Broadcasting Collective, and that started in the mid-80s, and it was around about, its primary aim at the start was to inform around homosexual law reform activities. Remember, this is a time when there weren't cell phones, there wasn't the internet, so radio was a primary way of getting messages out there in terms of, when demonstrations were on or whatever. This photo is from the 1990s, and Gay BC ran right up until the mid-2000s before it ceased operation.
Well, let's move on now to our next stop, which is just a little way up the terrace to St Andrews on the Terrace. There we go. So you can see on the left there, down the middle, St Andrews on the Terrace, the church.
Lovely St Andrews. And on the 18th of June 2016, St Andrews was the location for the world premiere of Gareth Farr's During These Days. And there's a lovely photo here, if I can just bring it up. This is inside St Andrews, and the Glamophones are practicing During These Days, which was a commemoration of the 30th anniversary of homosexual law reform.
Now, St Andrews on the Terrace is the oldest Presbyterian congregation in New Zealand, and their history goes back to the arrival of the first ships of European settlers in Wellington in 1840. The first service was held on Petone Beach with a congregation of around 147 settlers. Over the years, the church has been located around Wellington in various places. Thorndon Waterfront was one place, then on Lambton Quay, close to where Plymouth Steps are, and here on the Terrace. And this brick incarnation of St Andrew's Church was built in 1922. In 1975, the Very Reverend John Murray became the minister, and he oversaw the church as a centre of social justice. The congregation protests against the 1981 Springbok tour and apartheid. They stand in support of homosexual law reform in the 1980s, and more recently they've supported the Aotearoa living wage movement, refugee and migrant support services, and marriage equality. On the 8th of December 1991, after homophobic resolutions were passed in the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly, St Andrews declared itself to be an inclusive church, and so there were numerous same-sex commitment ceremonies held in the church here during the mid-1990s. They've also had regular LGBT Rainbow church services here since 1992.
One of the driving forces, if I can get that right, one of the driving forces at St Andrews for inclusiveness was the Reverend Dr. Margaret Mayman, and Margaret started in the early 2000s at St Andrews and really was vocal, particularly around things like marriage equality. And when marriage equality was introduced into Parliament in 2000 and, make sure I get this right, in 2012, Margaret and her partner joined a rally outside of Parliament. Margaret on that day unfortunately had lost her voice, and so her partner read the speech, but part of that speech goes like this: "The biblical call to compassion, to love your neighbour as yourself, provides the faith mandate for marriage equality. Today we affirm the dignity and worth of all people and recognise sexual difference and diversity as a blessed part of our created being.
Well, unfortunately, not all churches have been as staunchly opposed. Unfortunately, not all churches have been as supportive as St Andrews and the Terrace, and some churches have been staunchly opposed to same-sex marriage and homosexual law reform. In the mid-1980s, the Salvation Army rallied against law reform, and they were integral in collecting signatures for the Keith Hay and Peter Tate anti-law reform petition. The petition's presentation on the steps of Parliament in September 1985 was quickly dubbed the Nuremberg Rally for its resemblance to the infamous torchlit, flag-carrying 1936 rallies of the Nazi Party in Germany. Now, the presentation here in Wellington featured a platoon of young people, women in blue uniforms, men in white shirts, with sashes reading the motto, "For God, for country, for family." And a procession of people carried the 91 cardboard boxes supposedly full of petition forms up the steps of Parliament to the Parliament's doors, where they were received by MPs Norm Jones, Graham Lee, John Banks and Jeff Braybrook. The organisers hoped for 1 million signatures, which would be a third of New Zealand's population at that time. They claimed to have over 800,000 signatures, but a quick calculation by opponents revealed that only small stacks of paper were actually held in each of those 91 boxes, and so they began to chant the boxes are empty. Later, many of the signatures were found to be duplicate or forged, and some people, including school students, were press-ganged into signing the petition. So if you didn't sign, then you must be a pufter or something like that at schools.
Well, one of the other protests in Parliament grounds, we should just point out, was the Destiny Church protest against civil unions. And Destiny Church in 2004 rallied a lot of people to march through Wellington, kind of fist pumping in the air.
With their slogan, "Enough is enough."
Enough is enough. And this is a photograph from outside Parliament, or just on Parliament forecourt, where we started our tour today. But speaking of rallies and protests, and this protest and rally is in support of marriage equality. And again, this is in 2012, on the day that Marriage Amendment Bill is introduced into Parliament, and people marched from Civic Square through Willis Street, Lambton Quay, to the steps of Parliament. Now, the building they're just walking past is actually our next stop on the tour, and I'm just going to do a bit of a swizzy thing here, hopefully. And we're going to go jumping down to Lambton Quay, and we're going to be looking at this wonderful heritage building. This is the Public Trust Office on the left-hand side. Lovely brick building.
Built in 1908, it is believed to be New Zealand's first steel-framed office building. In the late 1920s, the writer Frank Sargison got a job at the Public Trust, and he was working in that building. At that time, his name was Norris Davey. By day, he worked there, but by night he enjoyed cruising the toilets and the beats of Wellington. One night in 1929, he met Leonard Hollobin, who was known to police and was being monitored. The two got back to Leonard's boarding house, where the police were lying in wait in the next room. Bursting in, they found the two in flagrante delicto, or masturbating each other, or in legal terms, committing indecent assault. Now, Norris was persuaded by the Crown to give evidence against Leonard and allow himself to be presented as the innocent party. In return, he got a suspended sentence, while Leonard got 5 years hard labour in New Plymouth Prison. After the court case, Norris went up north to stay with his much-loved uncle on a farm. But a couple of years later, the Depression forced him off the farm, and he emerged as Frank Sargison, the writer. In 2017, during the first reading of a bill to expunge historic gay convictions, the Justice Minister of the time, Amy Adams, made an apology on behalf of the government to all those who were affected by historic gay convictions. Now, the bill was passed unopposed and became law in 2018, and the first 2 expungements happened later that year.
Well, also in this building today is where the Ministry for Culture and Heritage live, and they have a variety of meeting rooms in the building named after various icons in New Zealand. And one of the meeting rooms is called Freda Stark. Now, Freda was born in Northland in 1907. Just jump 100 years. She was born in 1907. The family moved to Auckland, and at the age of 7, her father suggested that she take up dancing, and so she learnt the hula hoop, she learnt tap, and she learnt high kicks. In the 1930s, she learnt ballet, and in the 1940s, during World War II, she was actually at the Civic in Auckland, the Civic Theatre in Auckland, and she was painted entirely in gold and just wore a little G-string and became known as the Fever of the Fleet. And there's a lovely image here, if I can, of Freda, and I'm not sure who the male dancer is, but Freda's the one on top. Now, Freda nowadays is known for her dancing, but also for her relationship with a fellow dancer, Thelma Trott. And so Thelma and Freda met while dancing at the Civic Theatre and had a couple of year relationship. At the time, Thelma was married to a chap called Eric Mario, and unfortunately Eric didn't approve of Thelma's relationship with Freda, and so poisoned her with a whole lot of sleeping tablets. And Thelma died, and Eric was eventually caught and tried and convicted. So he was tried twice for murder and convicted twice for murder, and was sentenced to death. And then that sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Now, one of the really sad aspects of this story, one, Thelma died, hugely sad, but also Freda was dragged through the court process as a witness, and her lesbianism was brought out in the trial. There were nude photos of her brought out in the trial twice, and it was sounding pretty horrific for Freda. After the trial, Freda moved to the United Kingdom, but then came back to New Zealand in 1970. In the 1970s, I should say. And then she died in the late 1990s. But probably one of the sweetest parts of the story is that when Freda died, her friends were able to bury her at the foot of Thelma's grave, and with the inscription "Waiting till we meet again, Freda," which is just such a lovely thing, and just really beautiful.
Yeah. Moving on to our very next stop now, which is Midland Park, and the sculpture "A Woman of Words" by the Auckland sculptor Virginia King. Now, it commemorates the life and work of one of New Zealand's most famous writers, Catherine Mansfield. During the day, the sculpture reflects the movement of life around the area, but at night it's illuminated from within like a lantern. Catherine Mansfield was born in 1888. At 19, she left New Zealand and settled in the United Kingdom, where she became friends with the modernist writers D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. In 1917, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which led to her death at the age of 34. Now, Mansfield has well-documented relationships with both men and women. Her first same-sex relationship that we know of is with Mata Mahapuku, a wealthy young Māori woman who she'd met first at school in Wellington. Mansfield writes, I want Marta. I want her as I have had her, terribly. That is unclean, I know, but true. And then there's the second relationship that we know of, which is with Edith Kathleen Bendel. And Mansfield writes and posts letters in violet ink nightly to Edith and invites her to stay alone with her in the family batch at Days Bay, just across Wellington Harbour. Mansfield writes in her journal, last night I spent in her arms, and tonight I hate her, which being interpreted means that I adore her, that I cannot lie in my bed and not feel the magic of her body. I feel more powerfully all those so-termed sexual impulses with her than I have with any man. It's a great quote. And another favourite quote from Mansfield is, risk anything, care no more for the opinions of others, for those voices, do the hardest thing on earth for you, act for yourself, face the truth.
Fantastic
Great
quote.
words.
Yeah. Well, to tie Catherine back to Frank Sargison, who we've just been talking about, we have another New Zealand icon, and that is Nio Marsh. And Dame Nio Marsh on the left here is with Frank Sargison. This photograph was taken in 1965. Frank had just won the Catherine Mansfield Literary Award. And here they are in Wellington in the Catherine Mansfield Memorial Garden. And it's a really lovely tie-in, all those three together. Well, staying in Midland Park, and before Midland Park was a park, it was actually the Midland Hotel. And here's a lovely photo of the Midland Hotel. And I'll just remove us from the shot, and that's where Kirkcaldy and Staines is on the right-hand side, which is quite interesting. And so Midland Park runs right across that facade in front of us in the centre of the screen. And staying at the Midland Hotel in 1917 was the very, very famous writer Somerset Maugham and his secretary and companion Gerald Haxton. So that's Somerset Maugham, and that's Gerald and Somerset as well. So they were travelling through New Zealand en route to Tahiti. And it's a bit like Rupert Brooks. It was a very well-travelled path to the Pacific. You came via New Zealand. So at this time in 1917, Maugham was really famous. He had 10 plays already produced, had written quite a number of novels. He had met Gerald Haxton in France when World War I broke out. Maugham couldn't enlist, and so he helped out with the British Red Cross, and it's there where they met together. And Gerald Haxton was from San Francisco. Well, at the same time, Somerset Maugham was actually married to Siri Wellcome, and he would later tell a nephew, this is a quote from Maugham, talking about his bisexuality, he said, I tried to persuade myself that I was 3/4 normal and that only 1/4 of me was queer, whereas really it was the other way around.
Well, the Midland Hotel, where Somerset Maugham was staying, was demolished in the 1980s, and in its place came Midland Park. And it was here in February 2015 that the feminist, transactivist and community icon Shelley Tuariki Howard conducted a social experiment and education campaign highlighting the differences between tolerance and acceptance. This great image of Shelley was taken by Kate Spencer. Now Shelley stood blindfolded in the experiment with her arms outstretched and two signs beside her. One summarised data from the Youth 2012 survey, which showed that despite many hardships faced by transgender youth, they were still the most active in youth communities and helping and assisting others. And the second sign read, I am transgender. I honour you. Will you honour me? Awhi mai, hug me. In an interview with Jack Lynch, Shelley recalled how she engaged with about 25 people that day, and with some people she could feel the distance between them, and even though they were hugging, but with others she could feel the hearts engaging, and she felt the real sincerity there. Shelley reflected on those interactions and said that now you've got this information, what are you going to tell the children? What are you going to tell your partner? Are you going to go to the local school board of trustees and tell them that they have to do more for queer identifying youth? Well, sadly, Shelley passed away in November 2017.
Well, we're going to head to our next stop now. We've got a couple more stops before the end of the tour. Just to reiterate, if you want to contact us, please feel free. Our email address is below, walks@taonga.nz, and you can also comment on YouTube. Our technology now allows us to see what we're doing.
So see what you're doing too, if you're commenting.
But let's head to the waterfront now, and what a lovely day in Wellington. There are a couple of things we're going to point out here. First of all is the stitching here. This is the lovely knitting that we see around Wellington. And this is primarily done by a group called Stitch and Butch. And it's a rainbow queer group that meet regularly and make these wonderful things to cover lampposts and public seating. So if you're around inner Wellington, you'll probably see quite a number of these really intricately knitted
objects.
Objects, no, that they are amazing. Well, I think they kind of defy description, really, don't they? I mean,
they do.
Yeah. But that's by a group called Stitch and Butch, and they've been doing it for about 5 or so years. And it just kind of really brings Wellington to life. And the next part we're going to be looking at is actually the sea itself, Wellington Harbour.
Nice segue, because just over 100 years ago, on the 16th of October 1914, almost 8,500 men and nearly 4,000 horses were collected around here to set sail from the wharves here for the First World War. Now, there were 10 troop ships in the harbour, and they left on that day. On board were 2 soldiers, Norman Gibson and Roy Ayling. Now, we think they met at the Trentham military camp, or possibly a little bit later in Egypt on their way to Europe. They became lovers. Roy was 28 and Norman was 19. Now, the artist Tos Wollaston noted in his autobiography, Sage Tea, that Roy had told me how he had seen the younger while at the war poised for a dive when they were swimming and loved his beautiful body. Well, they were together during the Battle of the Somme, where Norman was wounded and was evacuated, and so Roy wrote his poems to him. This one in particular was published in the 1917 book New Zealand at the Front. Form like Hercules of old, mighty limbs and shapely mould, manly strength in beauty rolled, old sunshine. Now that we are far apart, longing makes the hot tears start. Who can ease my aching heart, old sunshine? Well, after the war, Roy and Norman bought a farm together. But later, Roy left Norman in 1931, and they both subsequently married women. In 1997, Norman's daughter Miriam Safira wrote a biography of her father titled A Man's Man, A Daughter's Story.
Oh. Well, also in the harbour is Matiu Soames Island, and we're going to be talking about, let me see, Matiu Soames Island. So it's that little middle island in the harbour there. And let's take ourselves back to 1917, and we're going to be talking about Dr. Helma von Danneville. And this is the doctor here. So the doctor cuts her hair super short. She wears a tailored skirt and jacket, a shirt, tie, and sometimes a mannish hat. So prior to World War I, the doctor had helped establish a health clinic in Miramar in Wellington, and apparently some say she had an unnaturally strong influence over the female patients she treated. Well, during World War I, the Women's Anti-German League, which was very strong in New Zealand, were very suspicious of the doctor, particularly with that type of clothing and also the rumours about her, and so called for an official investigation. The New Zealand Solicitor General reported, quote, "There is grave ground for suspicion that this person is a mischievous and dangerous impostor. There is much reason to suspect that she may be a man masquerading as a woman." Well, the doctor was asked to have a physical examination, and she had that examination, and that proved that she was indeed female. But she was still imprisoned on Matiu Soames Island out here in the Wellington harbour in May 1917. She was there for 6 weeks. She was the only female on the island. She was there for 6 weeks before she had a severe nervous breakdown and was taken off the island and into care. And then in 1919, she actually left New Zealand with a female companion, travelled to Australia, and then on to San Francisco, where she died, I think, in about 1930. But a very, very hard life, and just quite seemingly persecuted for what she wore, how she behaved, and thrown into the mix the World War One German Anti-Women's League as well.
Yeah, very sad story. Well, we've just about reached our last stop now, and if we turn around, we can see Frank Kitts Park on the Wellington waterfront.
Here we go.
And zoom around. There we go. So that green space there is Frank Kitts Park, which was the starting point for the 2016 Wellington Pride Parade, and it was also the venue for the Candlelight Memorial in June 2016 for the victims of the Orlando nightclub massacre. Now, beyond Frank Kitts Park is Frank Kitts Lagoon, which was the venue for the Beacons of Hope AIDS Candlelight Memorials in the 1990s. At the memorial ceremony's peak in 1993, there were services held throughout the country, from Kataia, Tauranga, Rotorua, Nelson, Christchurch, Timaru, Auckland, Napier, Palmerston North, Blenheim, Dunedin and Invercargill. In Auckland, there was a memorial service held at St Matthew's in the city, followed by the lighting of flaming torches. And here in Wellington, torches were held high, and the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra and the National Youth Choir performed at Frank Kitts Lagoon. An enormous event, really, when you think about it.
Well, just continuing on from that is our kind of final stop, which is around on the other side of the harbour, and that's Te Papa, which is the building now in our centre of the screen. And at Te Papa, they hold the massive New Zealand AIDS memorial quilt, and I'll just bring up one of the quilts for us to have a look at. So the AIDS quilt was first dreamed up in 1985 in San Francisco, and then other countries have come on board. So in New Zealand, the New Zealand AIDS Memorial Quilt started in 1988 with this panel here. This is made by Daniel Fielding and friends for Daniel's partner Peter Cuthbert, who died in October 1988. And it was presented as the first quilt panel on the 1st of December 1988, which is World AIDS Day. So each of these panels measures 6 foot by 3 foot, which is the size of an average grave. And so not only is it a living memorial to the person, it has, they're all completely unique in terms of, what kind of clubs, what interests the person had. But together they are also an amazing educational resource to teach people around about HIV and AIDS. So almost the entire New Zealand quilt is now held by Te Papa on the waterfront, which is really fantastic.
Well, finally on this tour, another influence coming out of San Francisco, like the memorial quilt panels, was the rainbow flag, which has been picked up by many LGBTI rainbow communities around the world. As part of Wellington's Pride Parade in 2017, a 50-metre long rainbow flag was paraded for the first time in New Zealand, down Courtney Place onto the waterfront, heading towards Waitangi Park. This particular flag was created in the United Kingdom by a group of people whose partners had passed away from AIDS, AIDS-related conditions. And this particular flag has been carried down the streets of London, Paris, Sydney and Singapore, and now Wellington. The rainbow flag was created by the US-based activist Gilbert Baker as part of a collective in 1978, and he refused to trademark the flag because he saw it as a symbol for the LGBTI Rainbow communities to own, not one particular individual.
Well, just our final stop is we're going to tie the flag back to Parliament, and this wonderful image here from Jack Lynch shows the flag, the rainbow flag, flying on the forecourt of Parliament in 2016, and this was to mark the 30th anniversary of homosexual law reform. I can't imagine what MP Norman Jones would have thought if he had still been alive, what he would have thought of this. But anyway, so it was the first time it had ever been flown on the forecourt of Parliament in New Zealand, which was very special. But rainbow flags don't just stop on the forecourt of Parliament. Here is an image of the Rainbow Room, which is in Parliament, and it is a select committee room that was dedicated to rainbow communities in 2008. And it's an amazing room. It's open to the public. You can go and have a look. It has various community flags. It has a wonderful artwork by Elizabeth Kirikiri. It has significant legislation like the Homosexual Law Reform Bill, and it has a lot of portraits of out and proud current and former politicians, which is really fantastic. And as I say, that can be visited by any member of the public, which is fantastic. And that
ends the tour.
That ends the tour. Thank you so much for joining us on this walk tour. Today, of course, is Father's Day, so we wish all the fathers a very happy Father's Day. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will be back most probably next month, and we'll enjoy your company again. One final thanks to
Alison Laurie and to Hugh Young for their research, again some of which has appeared in this and other walk tours that we do.
Yeah.
So we'll see you later.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Ka kite.
Bye.